I'm going to try and go through this In Thinking website. I've asked all of you to sign up, please. There's a lot of good stuff right now for free for business management, all of the different units, some information about QGIS, which is something I want you guys to review, the IA, obviously, and then stuff, exams and tips and things like that. So please access that as soon as possible. For this morning, I'm going to be going over 4.4, which is market research. Market research is not going to be very groundbreaking for you. A lot of you guys have studied this before. In fact, I was going to have you self-read a lot of it, but I wanted to test this program out. So 4.4 is all about how and why organizations carry out market research. So what market research is it refers to a range of marketing activities that help you determine the opinions, beliefs, and potential needs of existing customers. So you have primary and secondary research. They're used to help identify, anticipate the wants of the customers. If you do that well, if you systematically process and gather, organize, interpret information, you're much more likely to be successful. You're not guessing. Essentially, market research is carried out so that the organization can better understand the competitors, the market, and the customers. So it can involve a lot of different investigative measures. You're going to look at different demographics. You're going to try and identify the preferences, reactions. These differences can influence demographic factors like age, gender, income, marital status, family size, religion, location. All of those can influence preferences. So there's a lot of reasons why we gather market research. We gather information regarding customers' tastes and preferences so that we can do things like product design. We can determine the likelihood of customers buying certain types of products, and that's really important for product innovation. You can gauge the customer's reaction to price changes to see if you can raise or need to lower your prices if it increases sales, either way. Learn about new market trends, help business improve their marketing mixes, discover strengths and opportunities as well as weaknesses and threats. Remember, that's part of our SWOT, right? So you can look internally and externally, explain budget variances, which is something we just talked about in sales budgeting. And then at the same time, with market research, you can reduce risk, which is always the most important thing, by having more informed and smarter marketing strategies. So market research is conducted when required for a specific problem in an organization. So this type of market research is called ad hoc market, where you just do it as a one-off. So if there's something specific you need to figure out or particular issue you're facing, you do an ad hoc market research. Continuous market research, on the other hand, is done on an ongoing basis. So it's not really a one-off, it's something that's constantly being done. In general, there are two broad ways in which market research is carried out. You have primary and secondary research. Primary market research is when you gather new information because it doesn't exist. So primary research involves field work where you have to go out there and do field research. The main methods of primary research are things like surveys, interviews, focus groups, and observations. Secondary research, on the other hand, is you collect data and information that's already been collected by another source. So the information is out there, it exists. So field work isn't required, so the research can actually do this from their office. They can do it by looking up things on their computer. So it's also called desk research for this reason. The main sources of secondary research are market analysis, academic journals, government publications, and media articles. All right, so those are really important things, especially considering primary research is required for your IAs. So you need to be very, very familiar with primary research. So let's take a little bit more look at that in depth. Primary research, once again, first-hand data. It's custom-made, specific to needs, because you're asking the questions, right? You can ask and collect whatever data you want. It's essentially about collection of new data because it's stuff that doesn't already exist out there. So it involves a lot of field work, and it is, once again, surveys, interviews, focus groups, and observations. Organizations are increasingly starting to use a lot of online tools to help them with primary research. So things like SurveyMonkey to collect surveys, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, WhatsApp. They're collecting a lot of data, and they're able to collate it a lot faster and cheaper than before. A survey, the first type of primary research we're going to talk about, is a data collection tool to gather primary research about an individual and their opinions. So you can send it to a single person, and then you use a series of standardized questions. So these can be yes or no questions, true or false questions, check the box, picked, whatever. It can be used to get qualitative information, right? Although it's better suited for numbers, once again, the yes, no's, the more objective questions. However, to be of real use, the surveys have to have a large enough sample size. If it's too small of a sample, if you only send a survey to two people and one of those people is insane, then it's going to throw off your whole numbers. Half of your responses are going to be completely useless. So the more people you send to, the larger the sample size, the better. So remember that it has to be statistically valid by being a large sample size. So advantages of using surveys, they enable researchers to gather a huge amount of information pretty quickly. With online surveys, it can also be quite cheap to collate data over a really short period of time. Just WhatsApp it to 1,000 people, boom. Surveys are less expensive and time consuming than the other methods of data collection, like interviews and observations, where you actually have to sit down with people for several minutes and then change that into a report. And they can be used to collect data and information for a broad range of research purposes. However, there are some disadvantages. Surveys conducted face-to-face can be expensive and time-consuming if that's the way you're doing it, not online, especially when you're trying to get a really large sample to represent a big target market. You can sometimes suffer from selection or interviewer bias or poorly worded questions. So the survey is only as good as the questions you make, right? So if they're crap questions, you're going to get crap feedback, crap response. It won't be very helpful. So just be careful about questions being misleading or inaccurate, things like that. Surveys can be time consuming to complete. Participants, if they're really long, they might be reluctant to fill them out. They might do it in a hurry, so it might not really have a lot of thought or might not be very honest. Especially if they have open-ended questions. So questions like, why do you feel this way about the product? And so a lot of those surveys, people might be less willing to help out on. Answer choices, options in a closed question survey may not represent how the participants actually feel. So you're forcing them to pick from a list of responses that aren't really what they feel. Interviews, that's a dialogue between an interviewer, which is usually the market researcher, and the interviewee, which are the respondents, or whoever you're trying to get the information from. The interviewer asks questions to interviewees, a set of questions to gain feedback on opinions of the respondents. So they're similar to surveys, but tend to be a lot more detailed. Interviews are conducted usually face-to-face, although online technology like Skype are starting to allow us to use more technology for this. The advantages are that they're specifically designed to meet the needs of an individual organization. So you can interview whatever questions you want. They can help the business gain a amount of qualitative information. Because in an interview, you can ask follow-up questions, right? Oh, why did you like this response over that response? Why did you favor this over that? Instead of just a checkbox like in a survey. As only a small number of respondents are involved, this is a disadvantage because you're not going to find out the big population information, right? Potential interviewer bias might occur. So if the person asking the questions is leading them on, like, don't you think this is a really nice, then people are going to be more likely to agree with that. So you have to watch out more for interview bias with interviews versus other forms of research. Interviews can be very time consuming, therefore it's very costly because time is money, guys. Interviews, they might take a large amount of time to complete. So the interviewees may often need to be offered money or financial incentive. So that is a drawback where unlike a quick online survey, people will be more likely to play along with that, right? Focus groups. Focus groups. So this term was coined by someone named Ernest, I don't even know how to pronounce the last name, Dichter, Austrian-born American psychologist and a marketing expert. A lot of psychology and marketing do have overlap. So focus groups, they're a small group of targeted consumers with similar characteristics. So you put, for example, like a bunch of guys together or a bunch of females, a bunch of children. or they have similar interests, like all gamers or skateboarders or food critics, things like that. So you put these people together, and then you assemble researchers to ask them and discuss questions specific to a product. So a consumer panel refers to the focus group comprised of people who belong to the firm's target audience. So for example, if you're a motorcycle manufacturer, you're going to probably include loyal motorcycle riders and enthusiasts into the group and then get really good feedback from them. So you're not going to be including people who've never ridden or hate motorcycles, because that's not going to help you develop your motorcycle product, is it? So typically the researcher will observe, record, and analyze the behavior of the respondents. They might show them the product, see how they react, see their feedback, any criticism they have, and then it helps them make a lot of great decisions about their business and their product. So the advantages is it helps business identify the desires, preferences of the different segments of market, because you're separating different groups and categories. It helps the organization improve its strategy, doesn't it? The marketing mix, product, price, place, promotion. They enable focus groups, researchers, to gather opinions and attitudes of customers and what appeals to them as the consumers of particular products. But there are disadvantages. Once again, similar to every other market research in the primary method, very time consuming, expensive, and as the participants of the focus group are usually paid for their time, so it's not going to be cheap. Views and feedback are not always representative of the entire market because they're smaller groups. So once again, it might just be that that one group had an interesting opinion and it doesn't apply to everyone else. Similarly, there's a lot of peer pressure that can happen in focus groups. So if one person is really dominant and they're really convincing, they might try and get other people, or other people might just agree with them. Or some people might just try and be more polite. So you might not always get the honest answer out of everybody. So that's primary market research. Let's take a look at secondary. So secondary, once again, this is also referred to as desk research. It's where you go out and collect existing information from a previous source. Market analysis, academic journals, government publications, and media articles. These are also very important for your IAs and extended essays and things like that. Market analysis reports contain data and information about a particular product, market, or industry. So the market research might include up-to-date information like the market size, the growth potential, information on competitors. So they're usually really good because they're put together by a bunch of marketing experts. Examples of these might be Business Insider, Statista, Euromonitor, Eurostat, Data Monitor, and Nielsen. So these are all really good titles for you to look into if you're ever doing secondary research, particularly in business. So the advantages of market research is that the market analysis are generally, it's a lot cheaper, less time consuming than primary research because you can just look it up. In addition, as a form of secondary research, the information has already been gathered and is available. So a lot of times it lets firms access up-to-date market data and trends. Market analysis also provides detailed information on various aspects of a product, market, or industry, so you can get a lot of good details out of it. Market research agencies specialize in producing market analysis. So these guys know what to ask and where to look. Unlike you, who might be very new at research, so when you do primary research, you might screw up the questions. These guys know exactly where to look. Most organizations do not have expertise to gather data, unlike these big marketing research companies. But it can be expensive to use market analysis, as usually they don't just give that stuff out for free. You got to pay a premium rate to access that sexy industry report. For example, Statista is predominantly only available to subscribers, so you have to subscribe and pay. And that might not be easy for a smaller, broke organization, right? Market analysis can become dated rather quickly. So pretty much, unless they, look it up every year, you might lose time on the, like it might become no longer relevant, especially now with all this COVID stuff. The world has changed. So stuff from even 6 months ago might not be relevant to us anymore. Academic journals, also known as scholarly journals, I love these, and these are the least utilized secondary research by students for some reason, yet they're the best source. So publications include the latest educational research in academic theory. They're written and produced by leading universities across the world in different academic disciplines, things like psychology, science, economics. Examples of business management theory that appeared in academic journals could include like Maslow's hierarchy of need, that came from a psychology publication. Lewin's force field analysis, Ansof's matrix, Adams' equity theory, Hertzberg's two-factor theory of motivation. We haven't done HR yet, but this is stuff that a lot of this stuff is all in our course, guys. So it's really important, you can see, to read articles in journals and stuff. So Harvard Business Review, Psychology, Abnormal Psychology, Psychology Review. These are just examples of a few academic journals, and there's a lot of really great advantages. Articles published in scholarly journals contain the most up-to-date research in academic discipline. The data and information is going to be really reliable because it's produced only by experts, not by people from blogs who just decide that they want to be an expert in a field. These are people with doctorate degrees most of the time. And feedback and assessment of peers is given. It's peer reviewed. Before it even gets published, it has to go through a big system of acceptance and review. Unlike a blog that anyone can just pop up. The disadvantages, though, is that not all the information is relevant. So it might be a really long article and only one paragraph, is relevant to what you're looking at. So the contents, sometimes aren't always required. Universities and academic establishments tend to only allow paying subscribers access to academic journals. So once again, sometimes you still have to pay for these academic journals. Government publications are really official documents released by the government and agencies, unlike academic journals and market analysis. They don't really have a standard format. So the government publish data and statistics that cover a wide range of topics. They do things like economic forecasts, growth, unemployment, inflation, interest rates. They do demographic trends, so things like what the population is composed of, how many males, females, youth, ages, numbers of people. Tourism data, how many visitors a year and how much they're spending. Budgets, documents for the central government so they can prepare their government budgets. Two really good websites that contain government information which could be used for your IA or EE are Trading Economics and CIA Factbook. So the advantages of government publications are that the data and stats from the government are usually quite broad, comprehensive, and reliable and up-to-date. The governments won't lie. There is a large volume of government publications, a wide range of topics, so market researchers really have a lot of data and information. And a lot of government publications are available for free. They're not trying to make money, they're trying to inform and help society. However, because there's so much information available, identifying and locating government publications sometimes is difficult. It's like trying to grab a fish in a sea of fish swimming at you. And not all the data and information are readily available or obtainable only after a fee. So you still could get to a point where only certain low-level info is out there, higher-level stuff, you need security clearance and or pay money. Let's talk about media articles. So media is things like newspapers. They could be print or online. So the New York Times, Guardian, Daily Mail, Times of India, China Daily, Washington Post, USA Today. These are all known newspapers. News magazines could be things like Newsweek, Time, Business Week, The Economist. Business media, Business Week, Fortune, Forbes magazine. So there's a lot of really, really good stuff in here. Now, the only social media contains up-to-date information. So print media and stuff, the minute it's printed, it's already old news, right? Social media can be live updated constantly. So reliable titles like New York Times or The Guardian provide access to the content for free. Many sites also offer alert services so that whenever anything new comes out, you get a big ping, breaking news, breaking news. So back in 2017, you can see here, this is kind of interesting, but the top news circulations, there's not any of the big names on there. Most of them are coming out of Asia. And I think that's because a lot of the news and media is now coming online in the Western world, and there's not as much print or circulation happening. Anyway, let's look at the pros and cons, because those are important all the time. The online versions of media articles are readily available to users 24 hours a day, every day. Technology is getting way better, so people can access websites, apps. A lot of the larger newspaper companies and news broadcasters are providing. News media articles are released extremely frequently. They're often updated regularly too, so you can get a lot of up-to-date information. Market researchers can easily and frequently access that up-to-date info. Many media sources don't require users to take out a subscription to get their online websites. They just spam you with online ads. The growing popularity of social media and social media marketing, SMM, mean that news via media articles can easily be spread and shared across networks, so you can get the news out there and then access it too through your social media. However, there's a lot of potential bias from journalists and authors, so they might only show one side of the story. Articles can become out of date pretty quickly, hence irrelevant. Many magazines like the IB Review require subscription in order to access the resources. Once again, needing to pay for it is in general a barrier. So let's take a look at overall advantages of market research. It's quick to collect by contrast to primary research, which is more time consuming. It's relatively cheap because a lot of sources are free. For example, you can always look up certain corporate websites. You can look up online media sources. With digital technology, it's become easier for researchers to access data. However, the disadvantages of secondary research, the research information is not uniquely available, so anyone can access it. So you don't have an advantage. If anyone can see it, it's not information exclusive only to you, unlike with primary research. Secondary research and market data can become outdated pretty darn quickly. So that's another disadvantage. And secondary research that is already collected by someone else has to be filtered to meet a firm's individual needs. Once again, there might be like 17 paragraphs that are not relevant, and only 2 or 3 out of that whole article that is something you need. So I hope that helps. There's a lot of little tips in here. You can see it's actually a really good site. So I do recommend it. Let's just keep going. I know this is a really long video, but let's just get it out of the way. Ethical considerations of market research, because once again, ethics become a big issue. A lot of moral principles and values held by society. That's what ethics are, right? The moral principles and values that are held by society. When it comes to market research, this refers to how the research is shared and presented. So you have to consider ethics when you're doing this in order to prevent things like bias, because you want to gain the trust of the public. The worst case scenario is unethical practices can lead to criminal action taken against the organization. So be careful. If you purposefully try and manipulate people and come up with false information, you can actually get into legal trouble. Ethical considerations of market research include some of the following. The purpose of use. So the participants need to be told what the purpose of the research you're doing on them is for. You can't just blindly ask them questions and then use it for something that they're completely against. For example, telephone calls are often recorded, so the research participants must be informed that we're monitoring you. Many websites use cookies, so they have to give a little disclaimer. Your cookies are being, so they can track and see what kind of activity you do. Confidentiality. A lot of research participants should be reassured about confidentiality to personal responses, so they might be kept anonymous. So for your IAs, once again, you're going to want to promise anonymity to a lot of your firms, because if they're releasing financial data, they might not want their competitors to see that. Selection of the research subjects can be another ethical issue. If you're ignoring certain groups, researchers also, so let's say, for example, you're not selecting enough minorities or enough women or enough men or enough whatever, you're not getting the full picture. Plus, sometimes there's certain sensitivities of groups like children and elderly. Children, researchers need to be very careful about consent. They need to ask the parents if they're happy and comfortable with them answering questions. Researcher bias is the obvious one. Biased research, market research, can cause misleading information to come out. So once again, depending on how you phrase your question, if you're trying to get someone to say yes, you'll be very positive about it. If you're trying to get someone to say no, you might be very negative, and it influences then the overall data, just because you're trying to say something that you already believe in. Presentation of findings is also important. So make sure that you don't manipulate the information in a way that cheats or tricks people. So don't put the stuff you want people to see in really big writing and then the stuff you don't want people to see on the last page. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff on this. But ethics is a big part of market research, and it's something you have to be very careful of. Don't always just read a report and assume it's 100% correct. Don't just read a media article and say, oh, this is gospel. No, you have to look a bit deeper and make sure that they're being ethical. There is a distinction between qualitative versus quantitative. So qualitative research is a category of market research that is based on the opinions of the participants. So you get a lot of detailed, non-number oriented information. So it's very descriptive in nature. Qualitative research is considered discovering why. So not just what, but why. Why do people do certain things? Why do they prefer one thing over another? So on and so forth. So it's hard because you can't easily quantify why, you know. Quantitative research, on the other hand, is more facts and figures, so it's quantifiable data. So you can do statistics, look at trend lines, get percentages, things like that. Surveys with close-ended questions and observations allow for quantitative data to be collected because you can do counts, right, and percentages. It's normal for surveys to ask closed or multiple choice questions because it's so easy to analyze. Just put it into a bar graph or a pie chart, things like that. So a comparison of qualitative and quantitative research. The qualitative addresses why. They're open-ended questions. They use in-depth investigations, discover things like consumer behavior, preferences, choices. It's based on the viewpoints and opinions of the research subjects, generally more difficult to collect. You have to collate and interpret qualitative responses. It's not easy. It's not just looking at a quick pie chart. It's going in and saying, wait, how significant is this? You have to read through paragraphs of feedback and then come up with an overall summary. It's often reliant on primary research to discover consumers' preferences and opinions. So qualitative research, has to be done through primary. You can't really get it as much through secondary. It can generate a lot of information with a low number of respondents. So you can get so much out of very few people. The quantitative research, on the other hand, addresses the what. These are more closed and quantifiable type questions. So yes or no, true or false, A, B, C. Generally, it's easier to collect, interpret, and look at the results. It does rely often on secondary research to find data or information. It helps researchers identify trends because you can look at lines and percentages in order to inform their marketing strategies. Using quantitative research helps a firm make more objective decisions. So it's just, once again, looking objectively, yes or no, which one, number 2, or number 3, right? It requires a large group of participants because the more responses you get, the more accurate the figures are. Numbers alone do not reveal all the information to make rational decisions, though. So oftentimes you end up needing to use a little bit of both. And that's just the truth behind it. So let's talk about sampling methods, because this is really important. We've already talked about you need a significant number of people to get an accurate figure for market research, right? The term population is every member of a certain group. So in business management specifically, you're referring to the total group of potential customers in that market. So if you're looking at soda, you're looking at every soda drinker is your entire population. It's too time consuming and expensive sometimes to ask and survey an entire population. So what you do is oftentimes you get a sample of the population, see this little piece here, and then you hope that it gives you an idea of what the whole population is interested in. There are a lot of sampling methods. Quota, random, stratified, cluster, snowballing, and convenience are the ones discussed in this course. Quota sampling refers to sampling technique where researchers select a number of candidates from different market segments and then group them together according to their characteristics. So unlike random sampling, quota sampling requires you to have people who in a specific subgroup. So you can include them according to, you can group them according to their age, gender, ethnicity, whatever, and then start asking them questions. So for example, a researcher might choose to sample 100 females and 50 males, or choose to interview people between the ages of 30 and 50. So it's a specific group of people. So quota sampling, the advantages are, unlike random sampling where you just randomly have 100 different people, Quota sampling lets the researcher gather representative data on subgroups, so you can get specifically on the needs of those certain subgroups like male, female, young, old. It's really good for researchers who want to detect possible relationships between subgroups. So is there a difference or similarity between two different groups? It enables researchers to investigate traits or characteristics of a certain subgroup in order to improve the marketing strategies. And finally, the researcher has control of who is included in the sample. Disadvantages are that the researcher needs a lot of time to figure out the characteristics they're looking for, and the selection is not random, so the subject to researcher has bias. So they might only look at certain groups because they think they're more important than others, and they're not getting everything. So random sampling is exactly how it sounds. It's when you select arbitrarily, so randomly, um, every respondent has an equal chance of taking it. You're not measuring how many women, how many men, how many, you're just randomly picking people. For example, a sample of 20 employees are needed to gather feedback. Just get a list of all employees, put them into a random name generator, and the 20 names that pop up, those are the ones you pick. You don't take anything else into consideration. The results are good in theory because everyone in the population has an equal chance of being selected for the research. That's a big advantage. Results in theory could be free from researcher bias because once again, you're not picking the people who you think would do the best or the group that you think is better. It is a quick and simple method of sampling, right? Because you usually just throw a bunch of names in hats and pull them out. However, random sampling tends to only work if members of a population are likely to have similar views or characteristics. Because if they have very different views, you might just pick that one guy that happens to hate that, and then another person that happens to like that, and then it could really skew the numbers. The sample being random could be very skewed in general. You might accidentally pick all men. It could happen, and then you completely miss out on the female perspective. Stratified sampling is number 3. Stratified sampling involves dividing people into homogeneous subgroups. So this is before sampling, right? So each strata have a sample. So pretty much it's the group of people who make up representative portions of the population. So for example, if the target market consists of 30% men and 70% women, then you would take a sample of 50 people that would involve 15 males and 35 females. So you do that beforehand. You would determine what percentage of each subgroup you want, and then from there it lets you pick what types of people to sample. So stratified sampling, it's used to improve representativeness of various subgroups in the market. Researcher bias is limited as the sample is not controlled. It relies on random sampling once the subgroups are determined. So you just determine the subgroup and then you randomly pick 15 men and 35 women. The disadvantages though is it's difficult to determine the appropriate strata. Like how do you know which percentage, what's a good balance, especially because the process may be very subjective. There's no science behind it. It's just what the researcher thinks is right. More difficult to organize stratified samples because of the attention to detail you need to split it. So it's not that easy as it sounds. Hence, the cost of conducting this research can be relatively high. Cluster sampling, number 4. Cluster sampling involves identifying population by geographical clusters and then interviewing people within certain clusters randomly. So this might be based where people live and or work. Researchers would then conduct market research by visiting those different geographical areas in order to conduct the observations in their area. So the advantage of cluster sampling, going to the areas of your sample group, is researcher bias is minimized as the research subjects are randomly chosen within their different areas for this market research. And it can be used in cases such as regional differences in opinions. For example, commuters in London may have a different view about train operations than commuters in a rural area, because in London, the train is much more needed than maybe in a rural area. So it makes sense to separate by clusters. Disadvantage, once again, expensive, travel costs could be high. If there are many clusters spread throughout a large geographical area, you're going to have to move around. Results may be biased if the respondents are selected only from a small number of atypical areas. So making explorations Extrapolation, excuse me. So extrapolating is where you're just assuming something off of a few groups, and it may not actually represent the whole population. So just because you've seen a couple areas, it doesn't mean that's what the whole country is thinking. Covering a large number of clusters would help reduce potential bias, but this would then raise the cost. Finally, we have snowballing. Sorry, not finally. There's still more after this, but snowballing relies on research participants referring or recommending other subjects to take part. So it's pretty much using word of mouth with participants suggesting their friends, family, colleagues. So it's like, oh, my friend is really interested in motorcycles. Why don't you also interview him? So at the end of the survey or interview, the interviewer will ask the interviewee to recommend other people they should speak to. This process is repeated until the researcher gets large enough sample size for it to meet the requirements. It's useful to gather research subjects if it involves interviewing people with similar traits or interests. Once again, they'll be like, oh yeah, this guy's in, or this girl's in our club, and he might be interested in this too. It's cost efficient because you're not having to go out and look for people. You're being told exactly where to go. They pass on the names to you. You don't have to advertise. Disadvantages is results can be rather biased because you end up having people with similar ideas and tastes, so you're not going to get a lot of variety. This sampling method also does not enable researchers to know about the true distribution or subgroups of the population. So finally, convenience sampling. It is the most convenient way. Convenience sampling refers to the practice of using people that are easy within reach. So if you're a student in a school, asking your classmates, right? Because they're the most convenient people. If you're working in a factory, get the factory workers. Samples, so the advantage of this is that samples are to be created by research subjects are easily, readily accessible. You don't have to wait or spend a lot of time looking for your people to be sampled. It's the quickest and easiest and cheapest method of sampling. However, it doesn't represent much. So if you're looking at the whole world and you only got grade 11 in your sample, that's not going to be a great representation, is it? So it could be biased, could be atypical data. So you're not going to have a lot of use for that. Therefore, it's unlikely that convenience sampling will accurately represent the views of the target population. So know your different sampling methods, because when you go to do primary research for your IAs, you need to determine what type of method you're going to use and talk about it in your IA, right? You're going to want to let people know what you picked and why, what the advantages were over the disadvantages and why you ended up picking that one. All right. Results and collections. So this is a very easy one. Once market research has been conducted, the results and findings need to be analyzed, and then they have to be presented somehow. So you don't just collect a bunch of data and that's it. You need to then show it. So different ways of producing this data: bar graphs, histograms, line graphs, pie charts, scatter diagrams, tables. You probably used a lot of these in the past in science classes, right? So bar graphs pretty much is just a bar. It's great to compare figures in a study over different periods of time. So you can see here you got the different restaurants and you got sales revenues. So you can have several different variables that you're looking at, and then you can quickly see that different products across different sales. So restaurant 3 has the highest sales overall, and their biggest selling product are burgers. All right, yummy, delicious. This restaurant 1 probably has the best fries out of everyone. So you can get a lot of information out of bar graphs. Histograms are a type of bar graph also, but they used to show frequency over a number of range within a data set. For example, below you can see a distribution of grades, levels 2 to 7 on the x-axis, and how many students achieve those. So just looking here, I can see that about 24 students got a 5. All right. Not very many got a 7, not very many got a 2. So if this was IB grades here. So that's how you use a histogram. Line graphs are used to show time series. So for example, you can show changes in variables over time. So down below, you can see a firm's cost against the revenues over a 4-year period. So you can, this is great when you're trying to find break even, right? So you've got your cost line here, and then your revenue line. So at what point that's your break even? Oh, look, and then all of a sudden now you're making a profit because your revenues are higher than your cost. And it's over time. So when did they break even? You could say, oh, around 2000, halfway through 2015. So you can see how helpful and useful that is. Pie charts look more at statistics, so it shows percentages of different groups. right? Not going to go into huge amount of detail. Scatter diagrams show possible correlations between two variables. So when you're comparing two things like consumer income and spending or expenditure levels, in theory, the more money a person earns, the more they're going to spend over time. So market research can tell you, is there a strong correlation between that or not? So you can see here that this is probably uh, one of them is going to be spending, and one of them is going to be the wages. So I'm assuming this is the wages on the bottom here. As the wages increase, look, spending is going up. There is some sort of correlation. If you drew a trend line in there, you can see that yes, it's going up this way. Tables are another way to represent numerical data in different formats. So you can see below Singapore, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You know, so you can rank things with tables and what have you. Anyway, those are all the different things. Once again, a lot of great tips here for the HLIA. Okay, please read through these because you guys are about to go into your IAs very soon. There's a really good question bank that I want you guys to work on here. So you can see that you can answer a question and then check yourself, which is why I want you to sign up for this in thinking, get a total score. So I'm actually going to have you do a task where you answer the question bank on here, and then I want a picture of your score at the end. All right. Good luck, everybody. That was a really long thing. There's a lot in market research, but it's very simple, straightforward stuff. Take care.